October 25th, 1415. An English army, somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000 men strong, is sick, starving, and trapped near a little village in northern France called Agincourt. For weeks they've been plagued by dysentery, a miserable bloody flux that's as humiliating as it is deadly. They are utterly exhausted, hopelessly outnumbered, and hundreds of miles from the safety of English-held Calais. Blocking their way is the entire might of French chivalry, an army estimated at 12,000 to 15,000 strong. It's a sea of polished plate armor, a forest of lances, and a tidal wave of aristocratic confidence. The French commanders are so sure they're going to win, they're already debating which English nobles they'll capture for ransom. The French had every advantage you could ask for: numbers, health, equipment, and home field advantage. But they forgot to account for one thing: not a secret weapon, not a brilliant tactic, but the battlefield itself. For days, heavy, relentless rain had turned a freshly plowed field into the most shocking and brutal trap in medieval history. An ocean of thick, unforgiving mud that was about to swallow an entire army whole. So, how did it come to this? How did an English king get his army trapped, sick and starving, hundreds of miles from home? This isn't just a story about one battle. It's the end result of a desperate gamble by a very ambitious king. The year is 1415, and the 100 Years' War is on again. This long on-again, off-again struggle over English claims to the French throne has flared up, and the English king, Henry V, is at the heart of it. He's young, he's determined, and he's deeply religious. He is also a hardened military commander, forged in brutal campaigns against Welsh rebels, and he believes with every fiber of his being that God owes him the throne of France. And right now, France looks like the perfect target. The kingdom is a mess, paralyzed by a civil war between two powerful factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. The French king, Charles VI, is tragically unfit to rule, suffering from long bouts of psychosis that left him completely incapacitated. Henry sees this weakness, this internal rot, and thinks it's a divine invitation. After his own outrageous demands are rejected in negotiations, he convinces his parliament to fund an invasion. On August 13, 1415, a massive English fleet carrying around 12,000 men lands unopposed in northern France. Henry's first target isn't Paris, it's the strategic port of Harfleur. Capturing it would give him a secure base, a second Calais, to control the region and launch future campaigns. Henry figured the city would fall in a few days. He was wrong. The siege of Harfleur turned into a 5-week nightmare. The city's defenders were stubborn, and while they held out, the English army, camped in the marshy ground outside the walls, started to get sick. The real enemy wasn't the French garrison. It was disease. Dysentery swept through the camp, a disgusting, debilitating illness that left men weak, dehydrated, and dying. By the time Harfleur finally gave up on September 22nd, Henry's army was a shadow of its former self. Thousands had died from disease, and thousands more were so sick they had to be shipped back to England. The great invasion force was shattered. The smart, safe decision was to leave some men in Harfleur and sail the rest of the army home. Henry's own nobles begged him to do just that. But Henry V wasn't a man who played it safe. To him, a retreat was an admission of failure. So he makes a decision that historians still argue about for its sheer recklessness. He would march his remaining army, now maybe 9,000 men, overland, 200 miles through hostile territory, to Calais. It was supposed to be a chevauchée, a show of force, a defiant parade through enemy territory to prove he could march wherever he wanted. It was an act of supreme arrogance, and it almost cost him everything. The march began on October 8th and was a disaster from the start. The French weren't just sitting around. They shadowed the English, staying just out of reach, but blocking them at every river and stream, forcing long, time-consuming detours. The biggest obstacle was the River Somme. The French held all the crossings, forcing Henry's exhausted army to march south, away from Calais, desperately searching for a way across. Days turned into a week, and then more. Food ran out. The cold autumn rains started and didn't stop. The men were starving, sick, and their spirits were in the gutter. According to some accounts, many of the archers were so sick with dysentery, they actually cut away the backs of their pants just to keep marching. This wasn't the proud procession Henry had imagined. This was a death march. Finally, on October 19th, they found an unguarded crossing and got over the Somme. A glimmer of hope. They turned north again, focused on getting to Calais, but it was too late. The French army, now fully assembled and vastly outnumbering them, had moved to cut them off. On October 24th, the English came over a rise and saw them. Spread across the valley, blocking the road to safety, was the entire French army. The chase was over. There was no escape. The trap was sprung. The night of October 24th was miserable. A cold, heavy rain fell constantly, soaking both armies. For the French, it was an annoyance. For the English, it must have felt like the sky itself was weeping for their impending doom. But that rain, falling on that particular field, was forging the very weapon that would save them. When the sun rose on St. Crispin's Day, the battlefield was revealed. The fight would take place on a narrow stretch of open farmland, only about 1,000 yards wide, squeezed between two dense woods. This funnel was probably the single most important factor of the day. It meant the massive French army couldn't use its numbers to surround the smaller English force. They would have to attack straight ahead. But the real game changer was the ground itself. The field had been recently plowed, leaving the soil soft. The week of non-stop rain had turned it into a quagmire, a thick, sticky, clay-like mud that clung to everything. A French chronicler wrote that men sank to their knees with every step. This sea of mud was about to become the great equalizer. For hours, the two armies just stood there, facing each other across the mud. The English, holding a slight ridge, watched the French deploy. It must have been terrifying. Thousands upon thousands of men, a kaleidoscope of banners, and the glint of an ocean of steel. The French were arranged in 3 great divisions, or battles. The first 2 were packed with dismounted men-at-arms and knights, the elite of French society, encased head to toe in magnificent plate armor. This armor was a marvel of technology, offering fantastic protection. But it was also incredibly heavy. A typical suit of field armor weighed between 20 to 30 kilograms, or 44 to 66 pounds. Just moving around was tough. Fighting was exhausting. Being asked to wade across 1,000 yards of deep, energy-sucking mud while wearing it was basically a death sentence. But the French nobility, driven by a thirst for individual glory, were overconfident. They figured their numbers and superior armor made victory a sure thing. They'd learned nothing from past defeats at Crécy and Poitiers, where English longbows had crushed them before. Their plan was simple, a massive frontal assault to steamroll the tiny English force. The mud, it was just a nuisance. On the other side of the field stood the grim, ragged English line. Henry's force had about 1,000 men-at-arms and, more importantly, at least 5,000 longbowmen. These archers were the backbone of the English army. They weren't nobles, they were commoners and yeomen, trained since childhood to use the devastating English longbow. This wasn't your average bow. It was a 6-foot stave of yew that required incredible strength and years of practice to master. A skilled archer could fire 6 to 10 arrows a minute, 3 times faster than a crossbowman, and could shoot a heavy bodkin arrow with enough force to pierce armor at close range. The archers were lightly armored, which made them far more mobile than the French knights, and Henry had them plant a secret weapon in the ground. Long, sharpened wooden stakes, angled towards the enemy. This simple but brilliant defense would act as a deadly fence against any cavalry charge. The English were a smart, disciplined professional force, perfectly suited for the trap they were in. The French were a magnificent but clumsy Goliath, uniquely vulnerable to what was coming. For 3 long hours, nothing happened. The French, sure of themselves, and maybe waiting for even more men to show up, wouldn't attack. But the English, sick and starving, couldn't afford to wait. So, in a move of pure audacity, Henry ordered his army to advance. The entire English line picked up their stakes, marched forward several hundred yards to get within lethal longbow range, and planted their stakes again. He was practically begging the French to attack. The French nobility, insulted by this provocation from a worn-out little army, took the bait. The battle kicked off with a French cavalry charge. A few hundred mounted knights spurred their horses forward to smash the English archers on the flanks. It was a disaster from the first step. The heavy horses immediately bogged down in the mud, their charge slowing to a clumsy trot. As they entered the kill zone, the sky went dark. The English archers unleashed a storm of arrows. The knights' armor held up, but their horses weren't so lucky. The animals, struck by arrows, panicked, screaming, rearing, and throwing their riders into the mud, before stampeding back into their own advancing infantry. The few who made it to the English line were either impaled on the stakes or shot down at point-blank range. The charge was completely broken. The mud had claimed its first victims. Now, the main event. Thousands of dismounted French men-at-arms began their slow, agonizing march across the field. It's an image that is both magnificent and pathetic. A chronicler of the time said they were overcome with fatigue even before they advanced. With every step, the mud clung to their leg armor, turning their magnificent protection into lead weights. As they trudged on, the English longbowmen went to work. Volley after volley of arrows arced into the sky and plunged down into the dense French ranks. The narrow field meant the archers could hardly miss. Men were hit, they fell, and the sheer press of bodies from behind created a horrifying human traffic jam. The living stumbled over the dead and dying, piling on top of one another. One French monk wrote that their vanguard was so tightly packed that those who were in the third rank could scarcely use their swords. By the time the exhausted survivors of the first wave finally reached the English line, they could barely lift their weapons. The melee was a brutal, close-quarters slugfest. But the French were so crammed together they couldn't even swing their swords or poleaxes properly. And then, the most shocking phase of the battle began. The English longbowmen, having run out of arrows, dropped their bows. They drew their sidearms, hatchets, mallets, daggers, and charged. Unburdened by heavy armor, they were light and agile. They swarmed the flanks of the French knights, who were hopelessly bogged down. The archers moved with an ease the French could only dream of, striking at the vulnerable joints in their armor, at the backs of their knees, and driving daggers through the eye slits of their helmets. It turned into a slaughter. Once a French knight was knocked over, the weight of his armor and the deep mud made it nearly impossible to get back up. They lay helpless, as English peasants dispatched them with brutal efficiency. Some knights, trapped on the ground, literally drowned in their own helmets as they filled with mud. The flower of French chivalry was being systematically butchered. The French second line advanced, only to suffer the exact same fate, piling into the mess of bodies and mud at the front. After about 3 hours of horrific fighting, the attack was shattered. Thousands of French soldiers were dead or wounded, and thousands more had been taken prisoner. It was then that Henry V made his most ruthless decision. A small French force attacked the lightly guarded English baggage train at the rear, and it looked like the French third line might be getting ready for another assault. Fearing his tiny, exhausted army couldn't guard thousands of prisoners while fighting off a new attack, Henry gave an unthinkable order: execute the captives. Ignoring the rules of chivalry, which said nobles should be held for ransom, English soldiers went through the prisoners and killed them. It was a moment of shocking brutality on an already brutal day, a pragmatic, horrifying choice to secure an impossible victory. When the fighting finally stopped, the field was a vision from hell. Heaps of French dead lay in great mounds around the English banners. The scale of the French disaster was breathtaking. Estimates of their dead range from 6,000 to 10,000 men, a catastrophic loss that included the Constable of France himself, 3 dukes, and a huge slice of the French nobility. By contrast, English losses were astonishingly light, probably only a few hundred men. Agincourt was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. It was a win born from a mix of things: the discipline of the English army, the devastating power of the longbow, and the suicidal overconfidence of the French leadership. But more than anything, it was a victory delivered by the mud. The soggy, churned-up earth was the passive weapon that had neutralized the French army's greatest strengths and turned their gleaming armor into a leaden anchor. The victory at Agincourt turned Henry V into a legend. It crippled France and paved the way for the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which named Henry the heir to the French throne. And though Henry would die before he could be crowned, his victory at Agincourt was immortalized by Shakespeare, cementing its place as one of the most celebrated and shocking battles of all time. The story of Agincourt is a brutal reminder that in war, sometimes the simplest things, a determined leader, a disciplined army, and a whole lot of mud, can be enough to change the course of history. If you enjoy a good story from the mud and blood of history, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that bell icon for more. And let us know in the comments what other historical showdowns you'd like us to tackle. Thanks for watching.